January 23, 1943. Over the grey expanse of the North Sea, a lone shadow struggled against the wind. The aircraft had once been proud, sleek, symmetrical, and formidable. Now it was half destroyed. The tail was shredded by cannon fire. One engine hung silent, another sputtered black smoke. The left wing was torn open, its aluminum skin peeled like paper, yet the bomber did not fall. Inside, frost crept along cracked windows. The air smelled of cordite and oil. Oxygen masks hung loose as the crew huddled in silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Blood stained the floor where the waist gunner had fallen. Every vibration of the surviving engines echoed like a heartbeat, the pulse of something alive. The pilot, pale and shaking, kept one hand on the trembling yoke. Below lay cold waves and the promise of oblivion. Ahead, the faint outline of England shimmered through cloud. Somehow, the flying fortress, Boeing's B-17, refused to die. That day, the men aboard would return to base with a story no German pilot could believe, a bomber that should have been gone long ago, but simply would not break. By early 1943, the skies over Europe had become one of the most dangerous frontiers on Earth. Britain, scarred by years of German bombing, now served as the forward base for a new kind of war. One waged from the air, at daylight, across hostile skies. The United States Army Air Forces believed that precision bombing, conducted in formation and guided by advanced Norden bomb sights, could break the industrial spine of Hitler's war machine. From fields scattered across East Anglia, waves of silver aircraft took off each morning, climbing slowly through mist and cloud. They formed up in vast combat boxes, layered formations of bombers designed to protect one another with overlapping fields of fire. At the heart of this doctrine stood the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a machine that would become both a weapon and a legend. American planners believed that tight formations of B-17 Saab, armed with up to 13 heavy machine guns, could defend themselves against enemy fighters. Escort fighters lacked the range to accompany them deep into Germany, so the bombers flew alone. The strategy was bold, almost defiant. The men who flew these missions knew the odds. A single raid could last 8 to 10 hours, most of it over enemy territory. Every minute meant a chance encounter with flak, Messerschmitts, or mechanical failure. In those early months, losses were staggering. Squadrons returned home with missing aircraft and shattered crews. Many never came back at all. Yet among those who did, incredible stories began to surface. Tales of aircraft torn apart by cannon shells, peppered with holes large enough to crawl through, but still making it home. Mechanics would stare in disbelief at wings held together by a few bolts, tails half-severed, control cables frayed to threads. It seemed almost unnatural that these machines could endure such punishment. The secret lay in how the Flying Fortress had been built. Boeing engineers had designed the B-17 with a single goal: survivability. Its aluminum frame was a masterpiece of structural integrity. Instead of relying on a fragile outer shell, the aircraft used a robust internal framework of spars, ribs, and bulkheads. Each section could bear stress independently. If one part failed, another could carry the load. The wings were thick, their spars forged from solid metal and joined to the fuselage with overlapping joints that distributed stress evenly. Even its fuel tanks were placed within self-sealing cells, layers of rubber and fabric that swelled when hit, reducing the risk of fire. Control cables were duplicated, ensuring that if one was severed, another could still transmit command. The fuselage was divided by bulkheads into compartments, giving crews not just protection, but time to react, to fight fires, to save each other. Compared to the German bombers of the same era, the difference was striking. Aircraft such as the Heinkel Heese 111 or Junkers Ju-88 were designed primarily for speed and range. They relied on rapid strike tactics and defensive flexibility, not brute resilience. Their fuselages were lighter, their wings thinner, their crews fewer. The German philosophy favored agility, the American one favored endurance. To the men who flew, that endurance became something more than engineering, it became faith. Crews would name their fortresses: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, 909, each took on a life of its own. When a B-17 came home battered but alive, ground crews would touch its skin as though touching a survivor. In the smoking ruins of combat, the flying fortress gave its crews a sense of immortality. The German Luftwaffe soon realized it was facing an enemy unlike any before. Intercept reports described bombers absorbing entire bursts of cannon fire, losing tail sections, and yet staying aloft. Fighter pilots were stunned to see wounded aircraft maintaining formation, still firing back. It was not simply defiance, it was structure, physics, and precision welding turned into survival. By mid-1943, the legend of the Flying Fortress had begun to circulate through both sides of the conflict. To Allied airmen, it symbolized endurance. To the Luftwaffe, it was a problem they could not easily solve. The Daylight Campaign would continue, costly and relentless, driven by faith in a machine that could endure what no other bomber in the world could. And yet, behind every heroic return, lay a question: how had Boeing managed to build something that could defy destruction itself? The story of the B-17 began long before the daylight raids over Europe. It started in the early 1930s, when Boeing engineers were given a challenge by the United States Army Air Corps to design a bomber capable of carrying a significant payload farther, faster, and higher than any before. The result was not a single aircraft, but an entirely new way of thinking about flight under fire. At the time, most bombers were simple metal frames wrapped in thin aluminum. They could deliver bombs effectively, but offered little protection once attacked. Boeing's team, led by engineer E. Gifford Emery and designer Ed Wells, rejected that philosophy. They envisioned an aircraft that could take punishment and keep flying. The result was the Model 299, the prototype that would evolve into the B-17 Flying Fortress. The name Flying Fortress came from a newspaper reporter who saw the prototype bristling with guns during its first public display in 1935. Boeing embraced it, and the Air Corps did too. The design featured a deep, box-like fuselage with strong longerons running its length, reinforced by heavy ribs and bulkheads. The wings were built around massive spars, thick beams of aluminum alloy designed to flex rather than snap. This was not just innovation, it was foresight. Boeing knew that in war, survival often meant redundancy. Each vital system on the B-17 had a backup. Hydraulic lines, electrical circuits, and control cables were routed separately through opposite sides of the fuselage. Even the engines were placed to reduce the risk of chain reaction fires. The crew compartments were reinforced with armor plating, and the pilot's controls were designed so that even partial damage could be compensated manually. The engineers conducted brutal tests. They overloaded wings, twisted fuselages, and fired at mock-ups to understand how much punishment the structure could take. What emerged was an aircraft that did not rely on speed to survive. It relied on integrity. The B-17's semi-monocoque structure, an internal skeleton carrying most of the stress load, meant that even when its skin was riddled with holes, the underlying framework held firm. By the time production models rolled out, the B-17 had already surpassed expectations. It could fly more than 2,000 miles, carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, and reach altitudes above 25,000 feet. But its true strength would only be revealed in combat. When the United States entered the war, Europe was already burning. The Luftwaffe dominated the air with deadly precision. Britain's Royal Air Force had shifted to night bombing to reduce losses, but the Americans insisted on daylight precision attacks, a strategy that demanded a machine of extraordinary toughness. The B-17 was that machine. Its defensive armament grew with each version, from 7 machine guns in the early models to 13 in the B-17G crews manned positions from the nose to the tail, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner. Each station was enclosed within an armored frame that gave the aircraft its distinctive segmented appearance. German pilots quickly learned that downing a B-17 was no easy task. Even after suffering direct hits from cannon shells, the aircraft could often remain airborne. Crews would jettison bombs to lighten the load, feather damaged engines, and rely on the remaining power plants to keep the aircraft level. Many landed with control cables shot through, using trim tabs and engine throttles to guide their descent. Engineers studying the returning aircraft began collecting fragments of shrapnel, twisted panels, and broken parts. They wanted to understand why these planes were surviving when logic said they should not. Reports revealed a pattern. Damage in non-critical areas rarely led to structural collapse. The redundancy built into the frame distributed stress so effectively that even catastrophic hits rarely compromised the entire structure. By 1943, the B-17 was no longer just a bomber. It was a statement of design philosophy. Boeing's obsession with over-engineering had produced something extraordinary, a flying structure that seemed almost self-healing. Its rivals, including the German He-177 and the British Halifax, could not match its ability to absorb punishment and still bring men home. For every fortress that failed to return, several more limped back across the channel, landing battered and broken yet intact enough to tell the tale. Those returns did more than fill logbooks. They filled hearts with belief. The B-17 had become more than a machine. It was proof that courage, precision, and engineering could combine into something greater than steel. And for the men who flew her, that faith would soon be tested in the most unforgiving skies of the war. For the men who flew aboard the B-17, survival was not an expectation. It was a gamble renewed every morning. Missions stretched across the cold, endless distances between England and Germany. Once the coast of France disappeared beneath the wings, they entered a world where every sound, every vibration carried meaning. The rattle of 50 caliber guns, the hum of engines at full power, the metallic groan as the fuselage flexed in turbulence. It all became a language they learned to read by instinct. Crews developed an almost spiritual bond with their aircraft. They gave her names that reflected courage, humor, or love. Shoo Shoo Baby, a bitter lace, knockout dropper. Superstition took root in the cold metal. Some men swore that rubbing the nose before takeoff brought luck. Others would not fly without their favorite jacket, patch, or token tucked in a pocket. When a fortress took a hit and still brought its crew home, it gained a status far beyond machinery. The men would speak of her as though she were alive, as if she had chosen to protect them. In debriefings, pilots and gunners often described moments of disbelief when they thought the aircraft was finished, only to feel it steady again under their hands. They spoke of crippled controls responding just enough to guide them home, of engines running on fumes, of landing gear that refused to collapse despite shattered hydraulics. The flying fortress had a way of inspiring devotion. In a war that consumed lives by the thousands, that devotion became a lifeline. The secret of that devotion lay not in myth, but in engineering. The B-17's frame was a masterclass in distributed stress. Every joint, every rivet, was placed with purpose. Instead of depending on any single structural component, Boeing's engineers ensured that each part shared the load. When cannon fire tore through the fuselage, the energy dispersed across the airframe rather than concentrating in one area. It was a philosophy of controlled failure, the understanding that no aircraft could be invulnerable, but some could be unbreakable in spirit. The wings were the key. Built around two massive spars of heat-treated aluminum alloy, they could flex under pressure without fracturing. The skin was riveted in overlapping sheets that reinforced one another, turning the wing into a single living structure. Even when torn by shrapnel, the shape would hold. Critical systems were routed with foresight. Control cables ran through separate channels on each side of the fuselage. Electrical power had redundant lines and auxiliary batteries. Fuel tanks were suspended inside the wings within self-sealing layers that expanded when punctured, slowing leaks and preventing explosions. Armor plating protected the pilot, co-pilot, and key defensive positions. The bomb bay, often a point of weakness in other aircraft, was reinforced with additional bulkheads to prevent the fuselage from folding under stress. The result was an aircraft that did not depend on luck. It depended on geometry and foresight. Boeing had built a structure that could lose a third of its mass in combat and still hold together. Mechanics marveled at how damage often stopped just short of catastrophe. A burst might tear a wingtip clean off, yet the main spar would remain solid. A shell might punch through the nose, but the cockpit bulkhead would hold. When German engineers studied wrecked fortresses, they were astonished by the density of the construction. The aircraft weighed more than most of its contemporaries, yet it flew with grace and stability. It was a flying fortress in every sense, slow to destroy, steady to the last. Each detail, from the heavy-duty landing gear to the placement of the tail gunner's position, reflected the same philosophy: survival above all. The B-17 was not the fastest or largest bomber of the war, but it was the most reliable. It was the kind of machine that gave its crews something priceless: the faint, stubborn hope that they might live to see the next dawn. And across the Channel, the enemy was learning that this resilience was more than mechanical. It was a challenge to everything they believed about air warfare. To the German fighter pilots who hunted them, the B-17 flying fortress was both a target and a torment. Early encounters had filled them with confidence. They had cut through British bombers before, the Blenheim, the Wellington, the Sterling, and watched them fall apart after only a few bursts. Yet when they turned their guns on the American formations, something was different. Reports from Luftwaffe squadrons in late 1942 described a strange phenomenon. Cannon shells that would normally shred an aircraft instead left the B-17 staggering, but still climbing. Messerschmitt Bf 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S attacked from above, diving through the formation and aiming for weak points: engines, cockpits, or fuel tanks. But even after scoring direct hits, the fortresses did not always go down. They often flew in formations so tight that it seemed impossible to penetrate. Those that broke away were supposed to be easy prey, yet many crippled bombers managed to limp home, streaming smoke, one or two engines dead, fuselage torn, still flying. German intelligence analysts began to examine wreckage and photographs, trying to understand why. They concluded that the fortress was overbuilt, its airframe far stronger than necessary for flight. Every inch of it was reinforced, from the wing roots to the tail spars. For pilots used to fragile targets, it was unnerving. One Luftwaffe ace, Egon Meyer, reportedly told his comrades that bringing down a B-17 felt like trying to hammer a cathedral out of the sky. The psychological cost was immense. The German fighters had to close in to suicidal distances to inflict enough damage. They risked collisions, defensive fire, and mid-air explosions. The sight of a fortress still flying after absorbing hundreds of hits was demoralizing. It was not just a machine, it was a message. The Americans were coming, and they were not turning back. The B-17's structural resilience did more than save lives. It shaped an entire doctrine of warfare. The American concept of daylight precision bombing depended on the belief that bombers could survive without constant fighter protection. Each fortress was not only a bomber, but a fortress in formation, a node in a web of interlocking defenses. When German interceptors approached, they faced not isolated targets but entire walls of gunfire. The overlapping arcs of .50 caliber machine guns created lethal kill zones. If one bomber was hit, the others could still cover its retreat. The aircraft's strength allowed damaged planes to stay in formation long enough to maintain that defense. This endurance made the formation itself a living organism, one that absorbed blows and kept moving forward. The durability also gave commanders strategic flexibility. Missions that would have been impossible with lighter bombers became routine. Deep penetrations into enemy territory, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, were only feasible because of the B-17's ability to absorb punishment. Even when half a squadron was lost, the survivors often brought back reconnaissance photos, bomb strike results, and valuable combat data. Every return, no matter how battered, contributed to refining the campaign. The Luftwaffe, for all its skill, was forced into longer, deadlier engagements. German pilots had to spend more ammunition, stay exposed to defensive fire, and make repeated passes. Each time they failed to down a bomber, they drained their own strength. The B-17 turned endurance into attrition, a battle of stamina that the Germans could not sustain forever. Back in England, the sight of a damaged fortress returning home became part of the legend. Photographs circulated among crews, aircraft with tails missing, wings shredded, fuselages open to the air, yet somehow still intact. Newspapers called them ghost planes. For every fortress that limped back, morale across the base soared. To the men who watched from the ground, these aircraft were living proof that survival was possible. They saw the bullet holes patched with sheet metal, the shattered windows replaced, the names repainted in bold letters. Then, days later, those same aircraft would rise again, engines roaring, heading back toward the same deadly skies. It was not arrogance. It was faith built from experience. Faith in the engineers who had built something beyond the ordinary limits of war. Each fortress embodied the idea that endurance itself could be a weapon, one that wore down the enemy not through speed or surprise, but through relentless survival. And that faith would soon be tested on a scale that would define the future of the air war over Europe. August 17, 1943. Dawn broke over the runways of eastern England beneath a low veil of mist. On that morning, more than 300 B-17 flying fortresses were preparing for one of the most ambitious and dangerous missions of the war, a coordinated strike on the German cities of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The targets were critical, ball-bearing factories and aircraft plants that powered the Luftwaffe itself. The mission was bold, perhaps reckless, but it was also a test. Could the flying fortress truly endure the worst the enemy had to offer? The engines roared to life one by one. The ground shook beneath the weight of 400 tons of aluminum and ordnance. Crews checked instruments, ammunition belts, oxygen lines. Pilots gave the familiar thumbs up. Then, in long, steady lines, the fortresses began to roll down the runways and lift into the pale morning sky. For the first hour, all was calm, the rhythmic hum of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, the silver wings gleaming in formation, the coast of England fading behind them. Then, as they crossed into occupied Europe, the sky darkened with flak. Black bursts filled the air, shaking the formations. The radio crackled with warnings. Still, the bombers held course. The first wave, bound for Regensburg, faced the storm head-on. German radar had tracked them since takeoff. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe launched nearly 300 fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, climbing in disciplined formations to intercept. The air turned to chaos. Cannon shells ripped through the sky. A B-17 near the Leard group took a direct hit in the nose. The bombardier was killed instantly, yet the pilot kept the aircraft steady long enough to release its bombs. Another fortress lost 2 engines but stayed in formation, its wings fluttering violently. Everywhere the formation disintegrated into fragments of smoke and flame, yet within those fragments, individual miracles unfolded. One aircraft, nicknamed Fight in Swede, took more than 200 hits. Flak tore away the left stabilizer, and cannon fire blew holes the size of fists through its fuselage. The top turret gunner was wounded, the intercom dead, the oxygen system failing. Still, the pilot refused to turn back. The crew worked together silently, sealing holes with spare clothing, passing oxygen bottles hand to hand. Somehow the fortress held together. By the time the formation reached the target, only a fraction of the original bombers remained intact. Smoke from burning factories filled the sky as the surviving crews made their drops. Then came the long, deadly flight home. German fighters harried them all the way to the coast. The losses were catastrophic. 60 bombers destroyed, hundreds of men dead or missing. Yet when the survivors limped back across the channel, their arrival stunned even the most hardened mechanics. Some aircraft landed with engines shot out, others with control surfaces gone. One fortress came in on a single working engine, the co-pilot steering with the trim tabs because the control cables were severed. Another landed missing an entire section of the wingtip, the inner spar still intact, holding the structure together like a skeleton of steel. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission was both a disaster and a revelation. The cost was unbearable, but the endurance of the aircraft was undeniable. Every survivor was studied, photographed, and measured. Engineers at Boeing examined how the structure had absorbed damage, why certain hits crippled the plane while others seemed to vanish into the framework. The results confirmed what combat crews already knew in their bones. The B-17's internal structure distributed the impact of explosions like ripples in water. Its multiple spars and bulkheads prevented catastrophic collapse. Even when a section was destroyed, the remaining framework compensated, keeping the aircraft intact long enough for men to live. What should have been the breaking point of the daylight bombing campaign instead became its crucible. Commanders realized that the B-17 had proven its worth beyond any doubt, not as an invulnerable machine, but as one that gave its crews a fighting chance when none should have existed. The Flying Fortress had faced the full force of the Luftwaffe, and though bloodied, it had endured. But the test was not over. The air war over Europe was far from finished, and the next phase would push both machine and man to the very limits of endurance. The weeks that followed the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid were heavy with silence across the bases of eastern England. Hangars stood filled with wrecks, twisted metal, burned-out engines, shattered turrets. Mechanics walked between them with the quiet awe of men examining relics of survival. Each battered B-17 told a story written in steel and fire. One aircraft, the All-American, became the embodiment of that story. On February 1st, 1943, during a mission over Tunisia, it collided mid-air with another bomber. The tail of the All-American was nearly severed, hanging by a few thin strips of metal. Photographs taken during the return flight showed daylight shining through the gap, the tail swaying like a pendulum. By every law of physics, the plane should have disintegrated. Yet the crew held steady, adjusting trim, redistributing weight, and coaxing the crippled aircraft all the way back to its base at Biskra. When it landed safely, the men climbed out and touched its side in disbelief. That image, a fortress in ruin but still whole, became a symbol of what the aircraft stood for. Months later, another fortress, Ye Old Pub, found itself in an even more desperate situation. On December 20th, 1943, it was hit during a raid on Bremen. Flak tore away the nose, destroyed one engine, and left the crew wounded and exposed to freezing wind. The aircraft barely held altitude. As it limped north toward the coast, a German fighter pilot, Franz Stigler, intercepted it. Through the shattered windows, he could see the crew struggling inside, bloodied and barely conscious. Stigler could have finished them with a single burst. Instead, he escorted the bomber out of German airspace, saluting before turning back. Ye Old Pub made it home, a flight that defied not only engineering, but humanity itself. These stories circulated across airfields and newspapers, each reinforcing the myth and the truth of the Flying Fortress. What made it remarkable was not invincibility, but the margin of survival it offered, the extra moments, the added strength, the invisible second chances that engineering had built into every rivet. In October 1943, another massive raid was ordered on Schweinfurt. This time, without long-range fighter escort, the fortresses flew alone. The Luftwaffe attacked with everything it had, over 300 fighters, waves of flak batteries, and carefully coordinated traps along the return route. Captain Charles Brown, leading one of the formations, later described watching entire sections of bombers vanish into black clouds of flak. The air was filled with fragments of aluminum, falling parachutes, and burning fuel. Over the target, the formation was shredded. Yet even as fortresses fell, others continued straight ahead, dropping bombs through smoke and fire. One aircraft, Royal Flush, was hit 20 times, losing both outer engines and most of its control surfaces. The oxygen system failed, the radio was destroyed, and half the crew was wounded. But the internal frame, the same web of spars and bulkheads, held the plane together. The pilot used differential throttle to steer, guiding the crippled fortress through 300 miles of enemy territory and landing on the southern coast of England with one wheel down. By the end of that day, 60 B-17 Surd were lost, and hundreds of airmen never returned. Yet the surviving crews brought back evidence that would reshape the air war. Photographs showed bomb strikes that crippled vital German industries. Despite the losses, the mission had proved that daylight bombing could still succeed, but only if the bombers could last long enough to finish the job. It was at that moment that the legend of the fortress became more than a morale story. Engineers, commanders, and even political leaders began to recognize that structural endurance was as decisive as firepower. The B-17 had not just survived the worst, it had transformed the nature of endurance into strategy. When long-range P-51 escorts finally arrived in early 1944, they found an air war already defined by what the Flying Fortress had endured alone. Its resilience had held the line until help could come. In the ruins of Schweinfurt, German commanders understood something that Allied engineers had built into the bomber from the start: the that survival, when multiplied across hundreds of missions, becomes power. The Flying Fortress had proven that strength was not only in attack, but in the will and the structure to return home. The winter of 1943 turned the airfields of eastern England into frozen seas of steel and mud. The losses from the Schweinfurt raids were still being counted, yet the Flying Fortresses continued to rise each morning, their wings glittering under frost. For the men who maintained them, survival had become ritual. Mechanics patched bullet holes with fresh aluminum, traced fuel lines through burned-out sections, and rebuilt engines by lantern light. Each repaired bomber returned to the air not just as a weapon, but as a living testament to endurance. Despite the staggering casualties, the United States Army Air Forces refused to abandon daylight bombing. The B-17 had proved that even under the heaviest enemy resistance, it could strike deep into Germany and return. The lessons learned from each damaged aircraft were written into the next production line. Boeing, Douglas, and Vega factories implemented hundreds of modifications: stronger wing joints, improved armor, better oxygen systems, and electrically heated suits for crews flying at 30,000 feet. The most famous of these upgrades emerged in the B-17G model, which added a chin turret under the nose, sealing the last major vulnerability to frontal attacks. The Flying Fortress now embodied everything its creators had imagined and more. It was not merely a bomber, it was a system refined through blood and fire. Each battle-hardened detail, the staggered gun mounts, the improved self-sealing tanks, the reinforced tail, was born from reports filed by crews who had lived long enough to tell their stories. By early 1944, the strategic landscape began to shift. The arrival of long-range escort fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, finally allowed the fortresses to reach their targets with reduced losses. But the credit for sustaining the bombing campaign until that point belonged to the B-17. It had endured the impossible gap between doctrine and technology, holding the line until innovation caught up. Every mission carried echoes of the same question: how much could a machine endure before breaking? And each returning fortress seemed to answer: a little more than yesterday. The statistics told a brutal truth. More than 12,000 B-17 Sud would be built by the end of the war. Nearly 5,000 were lost in combat. Yet for every one that went down, several others returned home with their wings in tatters, their fuselages open to the air, and their crews alive. The aircraft's very design turned tragedy into survival data, lessons that would guide generations of engineers. To the men who flew them, those lessons were written in scars. Pilots spoke of watching sparks dance along bullet holes at night, of feeling the aircraft shudder as flak tore through its belly, of landing with tires shredded and fuel tanks nearly dry. Ground crews wept when familiar fortresses failed to return, and cheered when one appeared low over the horizon, dragging smoke behind it like a banner of defiance. The endurance of the B-17 was more than physical. It became a symbol of persistence itself. In towns across America, photographs of returning bombers, their wings shredded, their crews smiling, filled newspapers. The Flying Fortress became part of the American identity: courage forged in aluminum, steady hands on a trembling yoke, the will to finish the mission no matter the cost. By mid-1944, the lessons of the fortress had reshaped Allied air power. The doctrine of sustained, coordinated bombing was no longer a theory. It was proven through pain and perseverance. Commanders now understood that endurance, both mechanical and human, was not a secondary trait of war, but its foundation. The B-17 had turned the skies of Europe into a proving ground, and from that crucible emerged a truth that could not be ignored. Strength was not in speed, nor in armor alone, but in the harmony between design and the human spirit that guided it. But the war was far from over, and the Flying Fortress still had miles to go before peace would finally descend. When the war finally reached its twilight in 1945, the sky over Europe no longer roared with the constant thunder of engines. The great formations of fortresses that once darkened the clouds were now scattered across quiet airfields, their wings resting under the pale light of peace. Some stood scarred beyond repair, stripped of their guns and turrets, their metal frames used to build a world rising from ruins. Others flew one final mission, back across the Atlantic, before being retired or melted into the very industries they had once defended. For many of the airmen, returning home felt stranger than flying into combat. They had lived within the sound of those four engines for so long that silence itself seemed alien. Veterans spoke of missing the vibration under their boots, the rhythm of the machine that had become their second heartbeat. The B-17 had carried them through fear, fire, and endless skies. It was no longer just an aircraft. It had become a companion, a fortress that shared their fate. In Germany, captured Luftwaffe officers expressed grudging respect for the American bombers. They admitted that no other aircraft had absorbed so much punishment and stayed aloft. Reports from German fighter pilots described shooting at B-17 set until their guns overheated, only to watch the bombers limp away through smoke and cloud. One German commander reportedly remarked that the fortress should not fly at all, yet it does. The endurance of the B-17 changed how future aircraft were imagined. Boeing engineers, many of whom had spent the war improving the bomber, carried those lessons into the post-war era. The emphasis on redundancy, multiple systems backing one another, became the foundation for the jet age. Civilian aircraft like the Boeing 707 would later inherit that same philosophy of reliability and safety born from the skies over Europe. In the strategic sense, the B-17's contribution went beyond destruction. It taught the Allies how to coordinate precision bombing, manage logistics across continents, and integrate technological feedback from the front lines. Every returning fortress became a flying laboratory, delivering data that reshaped aviation science. The war had accelerated design progress by decades, and at the heart of that acceleration was the stubborn, indestructible bomber that refused to die. Yet beneath the triumph, there was sorrow. Of the 350,000 men who served in the 8th Air Force, more than 26,000 were killed, a higher death rate than even the Marine Corps faced in the Pacific. Each of those lives was tied to a fortress, to a mission that left behind wreckage scattered across fields, forests, and seas. For the survivors, those memories were inseparable from the machine itself. The B-17 became both a symbol of survival and a reminder of loss. In the years that followed, only a few dozen flying fortresses would remain. Some found their way into museums, others became film stars, appearing in movies that tried to capture their legend. When the engines of one surviving B-17 ignite today, the sound still carries something more than mechanical power. It carries the echo of the men who once trusted their lives to its frame, and of the engineers who built something so enduring that even time seems reluctant to erase it. By the mid-1950s, new bombers like the B-47 Stratojet and the B-52 Stratofortress had taken to the skies, faster, larger, and more advanced. Yet even among these modern giants, the memory of the B-17 lingered. The name Fortress remained, not by coincidence, but by inheritance. It was a tribute to the bomber that had proven what engineering could achieve when fused with the courage of those who flew it. Decades later, historians would look back and call the B-17 a masterpiece of wartime design, not because it was invincible, but because it gave its crews a fighting chance when all logic said they had none. And in that simple, defiant truth lay its legacy, the promise that resilience, once born of necessity, could outlive the war that created it. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is not merely a tale of engines, rivets, or aluminum. It is a story of endurance, a testament to what happens when human ingenuity meets the unforgiving reality of war. Every dent, every hole, every scorched panel told a story of survival against impossible odds. For the men who climbed into its cockpit, who manned the gunners' stations, who navigated through flak and fire, the aircraft was more than a machine. It was a companion, a protector, and a reminder that hope could be engineered. The genius of the B-17 lay in foresight. Engineers had built redundancy into every system, strength into every spar, resilience into every bulkhead. The Flying Fortress was designed to survive what should have destroyed it. And survive it did, not because of luck or myth or magic, but because structure, precision, and planning had been pushed to their limits. It became clear that in warfare the ability to endure could be as decisive as the ability to strike. Yet its legacy extends beyond combat. The lessons learned from the B-17 shaped aviation for generations, from the post-war airliners that carried millions across continents to the strategic bombers of the Cold War. It taught engineers and pilots alike that human life and machine could be fused into something greater than the sum of their parts. The Flying Fortress did not merely carry bombs, it carried men safely through the crucible of history. More than 70 years later, when a restored B-17 lifts into the sky, it is not only a spectacle of flight, it is a living monument to resilience, to courage, and to the quiet brilliance of design that made survival possible. In the roar of its engines there is a reminder: endurance can turn the tide, steel can embody hope, and even in the most destructive of wars, ingenuity can protect life. The Flying Fortress will never be the fastest or flashiest aircraft in history, but it may be the most human of them all, because it endured so others could live.